The last myth is that a recipe for success in permanently reducing poverty is more generous international funding, advances in technical expertise, and improving our modes of aid delivery. More money, more technology, better delivery. Some ways it seems to make sense. We would also very strongly that if you don't put that in the context of studying the history, particularly say in places like Haiti or Southern Sudan, if you're not aware of the history of injustice and oppression, you're working in a vacuum. And it's critical that we deal with that. I was in Beni. It's a regional center in one of the most contested areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And as many of you know, there's been, in the eastern Congo where this is located, it's probably most notoriety has been the raping and exploitation of girls and women. Something like 200,000 over the last period of time. It's an outrage. And yet in this little community of Beni, there's probably 30 or 40,000 people, and it's surrounded by instability as well. I met a young man, a boy. He was 16, 17 years old. His name is Eric. And he, along with about 100 other children, mostly teenagers, had formed a children's parliament in the midst of the chaos around them. And their parliament got together and they decided they were going to stand up for the rights of children particularly. And the first thing they discovered, there were 12 street children because of all of the fighting that was going on. These were just neglected children that were on the street and they'd been thrown in jail. And Eric and his team of people went to the mayor and to the police chief and said, this is wrong. This is not right. These children should be looked after. They should be in school, not in jail. And the authorities relented. They managed to get them basically sort of adopted or sponsored by a number of families, and those children, teenagers, all were back in school again. The next thing, they found a foundling baby in the immediate area where these young people lived, and the government wanted to put this child in an orphanage. And the children, the young people said, this is wrong. We need to find a family for this child. And eventually one of the parents of the children that were part of the children's parliament took this child in. And then the next thing they tackled, there were so many young girls, because of the pressure, the instability, and poverty, girls were forced into prostitution. And these were underage girls. They managed, once again, negotiating with the chief of police and the mayor, to get these girls protected and closing down these brothels. The police chief told us that the evidence of prostitution had decreased by 90% since these young people had been engaged. And then the last thing they tackled was girls were being raped while they went to walk a long distance to get water. And the older boys in the children's parliament divided themselves up into twos, and two of them would accompany each teenage girl as she went to collect water. And once again, it almost completely stopped the rape and attack on girls. I share that with you because it's that kind of leadership, it's that kind of ownership that can come from the very heart of the African communities and communities all over the world that can make a difference, even in the midst of a fragile state with all kinds of problems.
We had to rely on the support of the communities, and so we set up different ways to engage. We've got a commitment at De Beers worldwide and in Canada. We've got a policy on sustainable development. We're committed to it. That's the beginning of our engagement process. We have from the top down a commitment to engage. We will mine responsibly because that's our policy. We must do it. We have a best practices program. We must adhere to it. We expect all our contractors to adhere to it. That's the beginning for us. People have to buy in. We're going to do this right. We're going to do this transparently, and we're going to make sure there's local beneficiation, because that is a win-win. That's how you get the win-win. When you have that as your starting point, then you can really start to shape how you're going to engage. And for us, we start through formal agreements once we have a property identified that we want to continue to try to work. Right? You don't want to give away your competitive advantage of finding it, but once you find it, that's when we start the process of sitting down with the rightful communities and saying, this is what we have, we'd like to do X, Y, or Z here, and let's talk about how we can do that. So we move through various agreements at the beginning. We go through and try to find out, first of all, within the culture, who do we talk to? Is it the regional council? We were told in the experience in Northern Ontario, no, don't deal with the regional council, deal with the communities one by one. And you're talking some of the most challenged communities in Canada. Now, I love the communities we deal with. I enjoy going there. I've got some great friends. Actually, I was hoping to be on a trip there next week. Unfortunately, I can't. But that's where we start. But we're starting with communities that are fly-in, maybe 80 to 90% unemployment on a regular basis. Most of the people live on a little tiny footprint of a stamp-sized thing that's maybe the size of the property we're on here. That's where they've lived. $1,000 to do round-trip flight from Attawapiskat to Timmins. I can fly to London cheaper. So most people have not got out of the community. A lot of these communities, only now, I'd say in this generation, they're starting to get, in most communities, a high school. All right? I mean, most of us have children, I would assume, in this room. Imagine being 13 years old and looking at your 13-year-old saying, you've done really well at grade school. All right, now, we're going to send you maybe Thunder Bay, maybe North Bay, maybe Sudbury, maybe Timmins, to do high school with people you probably don't know, probably in a house you don't know anyone in it. They probably don't speak your language. They probably don't understand your culture. We might be able to see you at Christmas if we can afford it, having you fly back, maybe Easter, but at $1,000 round trip. And that's if you can get on the flight. The flights don't always go every day. Most days they do now. So that's kind of framing where we were. So when we start our engagement, we've got a commitment. We must have local sustainable development policies. We must have local beneficiation. So we then go from, if we're exploration, we've got something that looks economic, we'll move into what we call an IBA, an impact benefit agreement. That's more specific to the success of running an operation that's generating revenue. Because in exploration, you're not generating revenue. All right, but we try to put some kind of a bonus forward in some way, maybe whether we make the priority in hiring, maybe we're able to take, for example, a percentage of our total expenditure and a guarantee it's going to be spent in the community. We do what we can because it's the win-win. If we have a strong relationship with the community, then they will support us when we want to try to move forward. And it's open, it's got to be up front, we show them the books. So then we start the IBA negotiations. We have actually 8 communities in Canada where we have IBAs. And I think that's the most of any company in Canada. 4 in the Northwest Territories, 4 communities in Northern Ontario. We also have working agreements, things that would be a less impacted community, but maybe we're passing a power line over their traditional lands or something of that sort. The impact benefit agreement, when you sit down with a community of maybe 1,200, where you might have, maybe someone, you've got a limited amount of people who maybe return to the community who have university. Most likely you don't have any lawyers. Are they going to have to fly lawyers in? How do you start to be fair in your negotiations, right? We're a 123-year-old company, right? So what we do in our engagement is make sure there's capacity on the other side. And that's a big word for us, is capacity. We actually supported all the communities that we were negotiating with by providing them the opportunity to avail of support, financially and otherwise, to make sure they had lawyers. I'm not going to sit down and negotiate, we are not going to sit down and negotiate if we have someone who just doesn't have the capacity to negotiate with us. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, right? So I would need to get a lawyer. So how could we sit down in good faith and say, okay, let's negotiate this with chief and counsel if they don't have the benefit of having the same kind of expertise at the table? So we actually provided that opportunity. They picked their lawyers and they worked out their own situation, but that was the first level of engagement. Make sure it's meaningful, make sure it's straight up. All right, so that's how we provided that. That's the way we have our commitment in sustainable development. So then we moved in 3 to 5 years, by the way, to negotiate these agreements. They don't happen overnight. They don't happen, and you know what? And it's the other thing in your engagement, learn from what your community partners are looking for. What are they looking for? It's no good for me to say, I'm going to go in and give you this. If they don't want it, they don't need it. So we learn to sit down and ask, what do you have as a vision out of our partnership for you? And then you start that negotiation because they can't ask for the moon because you don't know if you're actually going to make all that money. One of our mines, I will tell you straight up, in 3 years has not made any money. The one in Ontario has been very successful. The one in the Northwest Territories has had a very slow start. 3 years we've been in operations that not yet made money. But we've met every single commitment, financially and otherwise, in that agreement.